G'day, you're watching Miss Hobbs Teaches Agriculture, and on today's episode we are going to be talking all about wheat production in Australia. Welcome back to another episode of Miss Hobbs Teaches. I'm a Victorian science, agriculture, STEM and business management teacher, and all of my videos are Victorian curriculum aligned. Okay, so before we get into it, I just want to introduce the idea that grains that we grow and products that we grow in Australia for agriculture are broken down typically into three categories, and these come into cereals, into oilseeds and into legumes. Now, an example of a cereal is wheat, barley or oats, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But we've also got oilseeds such as canola, and we have legumes like lupins and chickpeas. Now, back in 1788, wheat was one of the first plants cropped by those early settlers. Now, these initial plants, they were actually quite poor, and after this, we actually had what we call as the rust epidemic. Now, wheat rust, it is a leaf fungal disease, and it actually makes the leaf look a little bit rusty. And the big problem with rust is that we see significant yield loss, okay? So that was a really big issue that those early settlers faced. And we actually had one of our first innovations in Australia, and it was by this man named William Farrer, and he came out with a variety of wheat called Federation in 1901. And this was actually resistant to rust, and he was able to achieve this through selective breeding. Now, if we fast forward to today, between 2015 and 2019, the Wimmera region, where we're based, we produced 811,000 tonnes of wheat in the Wimmera area, and we were able to produce this over 347,000 hectares. So the Wimmera is a really key wheat production area. We're not the leading wheat production area in Victoria, that's actually the Mallee, and then that's closely followed by us in the Wimmera. Now, if we are looking at a wheat plant, the part that we're harvesting, that's called the head. And our head is broken into our bid and our kernel. And then we have our regular plant structure with our stem, leaves and roots. So when farmers are planting wheat, they need to be looking at their rainfall to infer which variety of wheat is best for their area, okay? So there's a heap of different wheat varieties. Now, some of these wheat varieties can fall into different classifications. Now, within our wheat, we have a variety of classifications. So our first one, we call it an Australian Prime Hard. We also have an Australian Prime White. We have an Australian Hard. And these different classifications, they are segregated by how much protein your wheat gets when it is tested by people in your harvest delivery process. Now, the majority of Australian wheat that's sold is exported overseas, and most of our wheat that's exported actually comes from Western Australia. And currently, our biggest markets are Asia and the Middle East for our international export. Now, when we are sowing our wheat, we have a few key factors that we need to consider. And these include things like our depth of sowing, our seeding rate, and also fertilizer application. Now, to work out your optimum depth of sowing, you should be looking at your soil type, its structure, but it's usually between 25 and 50 millimeters. Now, you've got a bit of a risk on either side of this. If you plant your wheat too deep, you might stifle its emergence. So it might not be able to come up as quickly or as well, and it's too far down. But if you plant it too shallow, so too close to the top of the soil, then you actually have the risk of damaging it through fertilizer or herbicide application. Now, the Department of Agriculture recommends to achieve a maximum crop density that your sowing rate should be between 150 to 200 plants per square metre. Now, to get your 150 to 200 plants to the square metre, you would be looking in a lower rainfall zone. So a lower rainfall zone is around 400 millimetres annual rainfall or lower. You would be wanting to seed, and this is a Agriculture Victoria recommendation from the department, around 60 kilograms to the hectare, okay? But in higher rainfall areas, you would be looking as high as up to 80 or 90 kilograms to the hectare. And this is where talking to your agronomist, okay, that's somebody who can provide you advice on these sorts of things, comes in, because they will come out to your farm and assess all of these different factors, because not only do you have to think about your sowing rate and your rainfall, you also need to be thinking about the variety which best suits your rainfall, because different varieties are suited to different optimum rainfalls and growing conditions, okay? So you should be, as a primary producer, trying to make really informed decisions. So, you can access different advice on the GRDC's website about each of the different varieties and their optimum. So if your agronomist suggests you a certain variety, you should go and check it up and go, yep, that's 300 millimetres of growing season rainfall, and I've looked at my rainfall records for the last few years and that's what I've got. So you would be able to say, that's a really good decision and that's something that I'm going to go forwards with. Now, the other thing that we need to talk about and think about when we're planting any crop of any sort is our soil nutrition, because we're planting our plant into the ground and it needs nutrients to have optimum growth. So, we're going to need sunlight, we're going to need rain, but we also need nutrients. And if a plant like wheat can't access all the nutrients that it desires, these become a limiting factor. Now, one of the key nutrients required for wheat production is phosphorus. And we're actually quite low in phosphorus in our soils in Victoria. And as such, that's where fertiliser application comes through. So we can then put in the correct amount of phosphorus into our soil. Now, another equally important nutrient is nitrogen. Nitrogen is absolutely key for plant growth. And when we apply nitrogen onto our crops, they grow really, really well. But we actually have some issues with nitrogen application. Nitrogen is actually also called urea, and you might have heard it called that before. That's its application name. Now, the problem when we start putting on too much nitrogen is that it can actually disrupt the structure of our plant. So when we're putting on nitrogen and we're getting the rain, after it, we see our plant really swell up and look really nice and big. One of the problems can be though, is if we have a late season frost, okay? So if we have a frost, toward the end of our growing season, we'll actually see our cell wall collapse, okay? And our wheat will go all sucked in, right? And this can be really impacted through heavy nitrogen or heavy urea application. The other thing you really need to consider when you are applying things like nitrogen to your soil is nitrogen actually increases your soil's acidity. And when we increase acidity, we decrease pH. Now, some of the issues with decreased pH is actually plant growth, right? So you aren't going to be able to see the same level of plant growth you would have if you had that much nitrogen applied and a neutral soil pH. So that's something really important you also need to consider. And another thing, okay, with this pH that we're talking about is when your pH is too low, okay, so your soil's really acidic, the soil structure begins to break down, which isn't very good. So ideally, you need to avoid this situation by happening and ensure that you're conducting regular pH tests on your soil. And one way that we can actually counteract this effect of nitrogen creating more acidic soils is through the application of calcium, because calcium is a base, so it pushes our pH from here to here, okay? So it makes it go up, and we can keep it at that nice and neutral point that our soils are wanting to be at. And calcium, we apply that through a product called lime. Now, when we were talking about our frost before, we can dive into that a little bit deeper. So what happens is we've applied nitrogen and our plant's got really, really nice and big. It's absorbed lots and lots of water into our little kernel. Our frost actually causes that water to freeze. And as a result of that freezing, okay, our kernel, it dries up and shrivels and it becomes this really, sort of little picture here, it becomes this really yucky shape like this. And the real big issue with this is not only does it damage your yield, frost will also damage the classification that your wheat can be given and how much money you can be paid for it. So when wheat is sampled at the end of, or when you're going to sell it and harvest time, it'll be sampled at a grain receival site. And here it will be assessed on its quality. So it will be looked at for its protein, it'll be looked at for any damage, so damage as in frost damage, and it will also be looked at for its moisture and a couple of other different factors, but that protein is the really key one. Now, even if your protein looks good, if you have frost damage, you're only allowed a certain amount of grain to be frosted per sample, and that will actually cause your wheat to go for a lower price than if it wasn't frosted, okay? So it can make a really big difference to a farmer's business and their back pocket. Now, whilst I did say even if your protein was high, well, often when we have a frost damaged wheat plant, we actually see low protein as well. And when we see this low protein and frost damage, it's usually because too much nitrogen has been applied. And remember how we've been talking about cells and their structure? Well, adding that much nitrogen to your crops, unfortunately, that is the effect that happens. So alongside getting really acidic soils you've got now, you also won't be able to get those high yields or high protein that you are hoping for to ultimately make that profit. So I suppose that's the thing that I'd really like you to take from this is Australia is one of the leading countries for wheat export. You know, we produce a lot of wheat. It's one of the key crops that we grow, but it's important to think about growing sustainably as well as growing for a profit. Because if you are growing and putting so much nitrogen on and so many fertilizers and whatnot on to the point where you're actually getting a lower quality product and a lower yielding product at the end of the day, it's not worth it and you're not making smart farming decisions. So I hope you have got out of this and you understand that your local rainfall area is really going to infer the type of wheat that you should grow. And there's so many amazing free resources which are Australian government produced from, you know, the Bureau of Meteorology, and they tell us about the climate predictions, they tell us about the weather trends and all of those sorts of things. And if you take a look at those, take a look at your growing season, you can double check what your agronomist is saying to you. And you can say, yeah, this is a good variety of wheat and I would like to grow this for this area. And further to that, you can then infer and make decisions which are data driven and informed so you can get the best crop on your farm. And that's what it's all about, is farms are a business and it's about farming with less risk, right, for that same profit that you're after. And farming with that less risk actually is also often more sustainably because we're reducing our level of fertilizer application. And you know, if we're not having to combat acidic soils, then we're not having to go and apply more and more lime. So that's the thing, is science is a really great way to help inform your farming decisions. Excellent. So in this episode, we covered wheat, its structure, the different classification types of wheat in Australia, alongside a little brief history of wheat being produced here in Australia. We also talked about the impact of fertilizer applications and how to combat soil acidity. Thanks for watching this episode of Miss Hobbs Teaches. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Please comment down below if there's another video that you would like in this series. Thanks for watching.